So, Bruce, now you tell me something. I heard from you a lot of interesting things about time because you're a science fiction writer and you guys really think about it in a different way from people who are not science fiction writers. Okay? Tell me this. I'm really, I like that thing that you said, like, if you want to think about future, go back in the past.
Right.
Yes.
Well, that's an old principle by a noted Californian futurist, Paul Sappho.
Mm-hmm.
He said that if you want to think a year in the future, you need to go 2 years into the past. Or if you want to think 10 years in the future, you have to go 20 years into the past in order to sort of understand what the heck's going on. But, in some level of literary expression, there's really not much difference between futuristic writers and historical writers. They're both trying to reinvent time. And in the case of history, you have the historical record, but a lot of it isn't true.
Mm-hmm.
And in the case of futurity, you have a lot more imaginative freedom because you can just sort of make up anything that sounds halfway convincing. But you won't be read in the future. It's like people in the future don't read works about themselves. They read older works. They read the classics. And then there's a problem with the way language describes time, because language is socially generated. So words become old-fashioned and concepts become old-fashioned. So no matter how futuristic you are, you can't divorce yourself from the language that surrounds you. You can make up new words, or you can borrow words from some other culture, but you can't stop language from getting old.
Yeah, and that's like an old dress that you put and immediately you say this is a period dress. But what, for example, from my point of view, not being a futurist, and I don't believe in future, by the way, because I don't know where it is, I have a feeling the flow of time is not linear. It's really, I mean, sometimes it's very emotional. The emotions determine the flow. I mean, how fast it goes. It doesn't, I mean, we count it as linear. And when you say like 10 years back and 20 ahead, it's a linear count. But I think that certain moments in count more than certain others who count nothing, So if I would draw time, I wouldn't draw it as a straight line, and I wouldn't count it like 10, 20 or whatever. What do you think about that?
Well, the experience of time, I mean, the measurement of time is linear. Because you go into the future at the rate of 1 second per second, and there's absolutely no way to stop that or reverse it. It's inexorable. But the experience of time is very non-linear. It's actually diurnal, because you wake up in the morning and you experience time differently, and then there's a huge chunk of the day, 8 to 10 hours, where you just don't experience it at all, right? I mean, you're unconscious. And also, if you're quite young, time really drags. Like if you're 5 years old, 15 minutes is like a terrible amount of time. Like if your mother tells you to sit in the corner for 15 minutes, it's a dreadful punishment, right? Whereas if you're 80 years old, 15 minutes is like the amount of time you'd spend dawdling over a cup of coffee, right? And you experience it differently, and old people actually have better measurement of the passage of time, but they don't feel it as intensely as a child does, right? So if you went and tried to draw a picture of the way time is experienced in a human brain and nervous system, it would be way non-linear. I mean, it'd be going up and down in big waves, and then there'd be periods where it was very antic and periods where it was very slow. But, in terms of the calendar, it's relentless. I mean, the leaf every day, a good day or a bad day ends in 24 hours.
But for example, when you decide to write your science fiction book, which is always set in the future, how do you decide when? How do you decide, how I know you when you write, you structure your books,
Yes.
you do a lot of thinking ahead. You don't just throw yourself into it and whatever comes,
Right.
So, and every book is different, and you wrote them many, and they're all set in the future or some other time, So
well,
how do
I
you
write a lot of work set in the past, actually.
in the past? Okay, in the past, but in some it's uchronias also.
Yes,
you
uchronias are a big deal for me.
Yeah, yeah. How do you pick up that moment? For me, it's a mystery. I'm asking, like, really, how do you pick that moment and invent it totally as a space, as an empty space? You pick up a free and empty space, actually, and you invent it, no? Or not?
Well, I got some good advice from a friend of mine once who said that you should begin a story with the most intense thing that has ever happened to the person involved.
Okay.
And then kind of stamp that out of, like, their space and time. It's like, okay, this is the cookie cutter of this person's crisis, the thing that changed them. Mm-hmm. Something happened to them that, like, really mattered a lot.
Okay.
So then you find that moment and then you radiate out in directions. It's like, okay, how did he get into this predicament and how is he different after it stopped? Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's a handy way to do it. Mm-hmm. Or you can look at a particular period of time, like some kind of bigger transition, and then ask yourself, who does this matter to? Mm-hmm. I mean, who cares about this? Mm-hmm. And then make that person the viewpoint character, mm-hmm. which is what I commonly do. I mean, I have, like, some social thing I want to talk about. This is like the period in which this big change happened. And then there's a person there who is kind of almost a video documentary figure, mm-hmm. who's, like, who has a reason to be there when the events transpire. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But then you actually need a calendar for it, and I do that a lot. And I have like a kind of calendrical diary for the book, or which a timeline. Like, okay, yeah. And there are events that I don't talk about that lead up to the book's beginning, and then there are events that don't appear in the book. But I need to have, like, literally a calendar of what's going on, so I can decide what to talk about and what not to talk about. Mm-hmm. And you need to understand a lot more than you reveal. Mm-hmm. It's kind of the key to interesting fiction. I mean, or it's the key to what feels like an authentic world. Mm-hmm. Where the author knows more about the world than he tells.
Okay, and also you have the thing of that your main character is never the famous character of the period, but some common person, while the famous person is somewhere in the background, huh?
Well, it's boring to write about. It's boring to write about the Napoleonic era and make Napoleon the hero, because Napoleon's already there, and it's much more effective if Napoleon sort of shows up briefly in chapter 7. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Right? I mean, nobody identifies with Napoleon. And besides, he's over-documented. I mean, everybody has some theory about him. But then when you say Napoleon,
you exactly know this is Napoleonic times. And I'm also always interested in how did other people live. We know only about famous people, or those people who wrote about themselves, or other people wrote about them. But for example, women are not documented in many periods of time because they had no access to public life.
Right.
So, and this
or if they were documented, people simply lied.
Yes. But very often in ancient Greece, for example, you don't have female characters, at all, just in comedies, And so certain times, like if we call them times of patches of time, big chunks of time, are really badly documented, So unless something goes through the whole of time and something comes out as an excess, it's an accident basically. Yeah. And these are always the second plan character. This is another of my projects, second plan people. Like if you take a photo, if you take a photo of something that happened 30 years ago, and in front of the photo, in the first plan, you have some person that is important. What's more important after 30 years, at least for me, is those people who are passing behind. Those people who you didn't even want to document, but they are the symbol. They are the they are the time, the presence of time. How the shops looked, how they were dressed. And not your mom and her face in the front page. In the front plan. That for me is fascinating. This kind of thing, second plan.
Well, you could play around with that a lot. I mean, if there are characters who are not famous, then you could easily make up fiction about them and have have it be very convincing. It's like, okay, this guy briefly met Napoleon, but then he goes on to do all these other things.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the reliance on documentation is kind of painful, because what people in the past wanted to write about is not what interests us, right? And also, we document a lot of stuff that is going to really just bore the hell out of people in the future. I mean, if you go back and look at like European records, historical records, most of them have to do with the church, because the church was illiterate.
Mm-hmm.
And the clerics literally were clerks. They had nothing to do except write stuff down. So they wrote down incredible amounts of stuff that we just don't pay any attention to.
Mm-hmm.
Like, birth records, death records, marriage records. I mean, they're there, they're in the history. They were legally required to do it. There's stacks and stacks and stacks of these statistics. But it's like, it's like the banking records that we saw in our villa. There are enough banking records there to fill up a 4-story palace. And they finally removed these records that literally nobody wanted to look at, and yet they're still precious. They've kept all of it.
But if you keep everything, you keep nothing.
That's very true. And if and if you write about everything, you're not telling a story.
Saying anything. So you have to pick up, and you have to understand, and you have to know what you want to say. What you try to say, what you understood. So I think that's it.